Good evening, everybody. I'm Joseph Kiernan. I'm the provost of the Metropolitan Campus, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here this evening to our latest installment of the UN Pathways Lecture Series. Tonight we are very pleased to have with us Ambassador Guillermo Ryshinsky from Canada, our neighbor to the north. For those of you that have been here several times before and are used to watching Ambassador Kamal engage in battle with the ambassador that chooses to visit, the part of Ambassador Kamal this evening will be played by Associate Provost Jason Scorza. And every other evening from now on that we have the Pathways, I believe. So we will, without further delay, let Jason take over and enjoy the evening in the lecture. Thank you.
Ambassador, welcome to Fairleigh Dickinson University. We have before us a group of students who are keen observers and keen critics of political affairs. And they think they know everything there is to know about Canada because they've seen a few movies. Shall we begin by perhaps reorienting them
Absolutely.
on what Canada is and what Canada represents in the world stage?
Very good.
Okay.
Great. Well, first and foremost, let me thank you, Professor Scorza and Professor Kiernan, for the opportunity to be here with you this evening. I was saying earlier, I really do enjoy getting away from the east side of Manhattan and the bubble of the UN and coming and talking at universities because it's people like yourselves that keep me sharp and also keep me connected to the real world and not necessarily the life that we lead at the UN of resolutions and meetings and debates. And so for me it's very, very important, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be here. Canada on the world stage, what would I offer to you as an unvarnished view on the part of someone who has served Canada for the last 32 years as a diplomat? First and foremost, I think it's important to understand that Canada is what they call in the lexicon of political science a middle power. That means that we do not have the throw weight that the United States or China or major powers in the world have, but we have been, as a function of our history, inexorably linked with the United States in many ways, and I would like to think that we are similar to the United States, but at the same time very, very different. Different in the way we've organized ourselves as a society. We are a federalist state, as is the U.S., but in Canada, because of the size of our country perhaps, we have tended to focus on a level of decentralization of government that is anathema to most Americans. Most Canadians interact with their government at the local level, at the provincial level, and in fact, we were one of the few countries in the world that does not have a national ministry of education. There's no Secretary of Education in Canada. Each province in Canada organizes education as it sees fit. Another issue that's important to understand about Canada is that the ownership of natural resources in Canada rests not with the national state, but with the province. So the oil in Alberta, the forests of New Brunswick, the natural gas offshore in Nova Scotia are resources that are not property of Canada. They are property of each individual province. So as a result, when Canada goes abroad on the understanding that it needs to build a national consensus around the issues that are important to us. And as a society that over the course of the last 70 plus years has been characterized first and foremost by migration to Canada, by large numbers of people from all over the world, we have to reflect the diversity and the tolerance, if you will, of our society in the kinds of issues that we perceive to be important globally. Canada has been a leader on a number of issues over the course of the last 20 or 30 years that are of note. Canada was the intellectual brainpower behind things such as the Ottawa Convention to ban landmines, also in areas such as the responsibility to protect which was a Canadian idea that was brought forward and then adopted in the UN context and has now become part of the landscape, and other initiatives including such as the Kimberley process, which arose from the Blood Diamonds issue in Africa, was an initiative of one of my predecessors at the UN. But because Canada is a middle power, it has always tended to have a brokerage function from the point of view of its participation in key global situational dynamics that have arisen. Going back to the 1950s, during the Suez Crisis, when Lester Pearson, the then Minister of Foreign Affairs, Secretary of External Affairs of Canada, put forward the notion that as a means of ensuring being able to keep the peace in the Sinai after the Sinai crisis in '56, actually put forward the notion of peacekeeping, which has been at the center of what the United Nations has done in many, many parts of the world. So it is that element, if you will, of what Canada does that is in relation to its size, that is in relation to its national identity and priorities, that really does characterize the kind of country that we are in the world.
Well, thank you for that introduction. You've touched on a number of points that I hope we can come back to. But let's start with the diplomatic priorities of Canada today. You mentioned, of course, the Landmine Convention, interest in peacekeeping, interest in protection of non-combatants in combat situations. What are your priorities right now?
I would say that Canada's priorities first and foremost rest in areas of humanitarian issues. We're a major contributor to the Office of the Coordinator for Humanitarian Affairs, a top 8 contributor in terms of the funding for humanitarian response, whether it be to famine, whether it be to refugee situations, whether it be, for example, to natural disaster like we've just seen with the typhoon in the Philippines. I think Canada as a humanitarian actor is something that our country is quite comfortable with. And that and the area of human rights probably take up the bulk of my time as ambassador to the United Nations. Under the leadership of Minister John Baird, our current Minister of Foreign Affairs, Canada has come to pursue an agenda that we call at home the Dignity Agenda. The Dignity Agenda encompasses issues associated with the protection and advancement of human rights for the most vulnerable, for children, child protection, children in armed conflict, for women and girls, the creation of the International Day of the Girl in 2011 by the United Nations, a Canadian initiative. And tomorrow I will table in the United Nations in the Third Commission, the Human Rights Commission, the first ever resolution brought to the United Nations on the issue of child, early and forced marriage. So these are issues that Canada is at the forefront as part of its dignity agenda. It also encompasses things like the protection of lesbian, gay, and transgender rights around the world. In a lot of countries, not only is there persecution of those who choose to express their sexuality in a differentiated fashion, but in many instances, the penalty of death is imposed. And from a Canadian perspective, we think it's unacceptable for people to be persecuted for those beliefs, as they should be for their ability to express themselves freely. Religious freedom, we have an Office of Religious Freedom as part of our Ministry of Foreign Affairs that works extensively to ensure that there is space for free religious practice and protection of religious minorities, whether it's Baha'is in Iran or Muslims in Burma. So from that standpoint, these things constitute that dignity agenda that our minister has put forward. We also work very, very extensively in the UN in the development area, and I would say that these priorities are at the forefront of what Canada does both here in New York and the execution of development cooperation around the planet. Canada channels about 40% of all of its development assistance funding through UN agencies, UNICEF, UNDP, UN Women, the specialized agencies of the United Nations, and we also undertake extensive bilateral cooperation with partners around the world. And the singular issues for us in the context of the Millennium Development Goals have been, again, consistent with that dignity agenda, maternal and child health issues. Our Prime Minister is a leader in the G8 in mobilizing over $10 billion to support maternal and child health initiatives, and also issues associated with vaccination programs, the fight against HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, and other communicable diseases. We continue to be a major participant in peacekeeping. but we don't do so much now with troops. We do so through financial contributions. Canada contributes in excess of $300 million a year to the UN peacekeeping budget. And in the area of police deployment, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police continues to send many of its officers around the world to places like Haiti, to South Sudan, Cote d'Ivoire. Canada, as a bilingual country, is hugely important to the UN because we have the ability to deploy police officers and military personnel who not only speak English but also speak French, and that helps a little bit if you're working in Central or Western Africa. So these are the kinds of priorities that we work on at the United Nations and foreign policy priorities. But I should say that if there is one overarching foreign policy priority for Canada, it is our relationship with this country, the United States. There is no relationship more important to us. As former Prime Minister of Canada, when he was once asked what it was like to share geographic space with the United States, he said it was a bit like a mouse who sleeps in the same bed with an elephant. The elephant hardly knows the mouse is there, but that mouse is aware of every single move that elephant makes. And I think that characterizes very much the relationship that we as Canada have with this country.
Well, let's come back to that in a few minutes. I'm still trying to process the metaphor. I'd like to talk a little bit about what it's like to pursue this dignity agenda through the UN. You mentioned 40% of your foreign aid budget goes through UN agencies. I would suspect, can't do the research right now, but I would suspect that's among the highest of UN members. Can you tell us a little bit about why the UN is such a focal point for Canadian diplomacy and for Canadian foreign policy, and what challenges you've had in working within the UN system?
Well, I think one of the reasons we channel so much of our development assistance through the UN is critical mass. I mean, the UN is present in many, many countries. Over 160 countries count with a resident UN presence. As a small country of 34 million people, Canada just isn't capable of being everywhere. So working through entities such as UNICEF, such as the United Nations Development Program, provides us not only with an ability to coordinate aid with other donors, but also provides us with the entree into many countries that would simply be beyond our reach if we were trying to develop those alone. For many years, we tried to be everywhere. And by the 1980s, we realized we couldn't. And so as a result, and in response to directives from the OECD and the Development Assistance Committee of the OECD, we really began to focus our aid bilaterally in a smaller number of countries around the world. Today, our development colleagues in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs probably have about 20 countries that are countries of focus. But there are requirements in many, many countries around the world, and the UN provides the window, if you will, for us to be able to engage in places where we may not have a physical presence. So that's important. Also, I think the issues that the UN pursues from the point of view of its development programming dovetail very, very nicely with what Canada's priorities are. Child protection is a singular priority for Canada, whether it be from the perspective of health, from the perspective of education, from the perspective of economic empowerment, so that children have the tools necessary to be able to succeed in life. The UN does enormously important work through UNICEF and through other entities, and we're happy to partner with them. And as a result of this, here in New York, Canada sits on the board of directors of UNICEF. We sit on the board of directors of UN Women and of the United Nations Fund for Population. So all of this, I think, has created a very productive symbiotic relationship between our priorities and the larger priorities of the United Nations that has allowed our development cooperation to flourish. It's not perfect. There's a lot of inefficiency at times. We continue to exhort the UN agencies to do better in terms of accountability. Not just because it's our money that we're investing, but also the money of many other donors. And in this day and age, you have to show value and you have to demonstrate results. And that culture of accountability that we have tried to bring to the UN is something that we try to have in Canada as well, as a very transparent, very open society. And we have been able, through work here in New York, to ensure, for example, that UNICEF and UNDP post their audit reports publicly so that scrutiny can be brought from the point of view of how money is spent, what it's spent on, what it's resulted in. And we think that that's a very, very important Canadian contribution, not only now but going forward.
Thank you. We all understand that there's a kind of hierarchy in the United Nations, that all countries are, of course, equal, but some are more equal than others. If you could secure for Canada, this is a hypothetical, a permanent seat on the Security Council, would you want it?
We are opposed to permanent seats as a matter of principle. We believe that what transpired in 1946 at the time of founding of the United Nations has placed us now in a situation that we can't get out from under. There are 5 permanent members. Those permanent members aren't going to leave those seats voluntarily, so in essence the world is stuck with them. Now if we were to add 6 more permanent members, as some would like, we'd have 11 permanent members that we would be stuck with. What Canada believes is that there should be more transparency and democratization of the UN security by expanding membership so that more countries can participate. Remarkably, less than 60 of the total number of members of the United Nations have ever served on the Security Council. There's a lot of countries that simply haven't had the opportunity, couldn't do it because of their size, unless they were able to partner with another country. We'd like to see that possibility open so that a seat could be shared by 2 small island states so that they could be participants. But Security Council reform depends first and foremost on the 5, and consensus, because that's how the UN operates, of the other 188 members. That's hard to do. And the issue of veto, of course, comes into the mix. Canada was opposed to the veto when the UN was created. We continue to be opposed to it now. We would not like to see new members added of a permanent nature with veto power, because we think that that would be deleterious to the operation of the organization. So what does Canada do? Every decade or so, we come and we present ourselves as a candidate for Security Council election. And for 6 decades, we were successful. The last time we came as a candidate in 2010, we were not. It was a bit of a wake-up call for us. We expected to be elected and weren't. We will probably come back and seek re-election, but not right away. But we are part of a geographic grouping that includes Western European countries and other countries such as Turkey, such as Australia, such as New Zealand, Israel. And so from that standpoint, when you have contested seats, and then you only have 2 openings and 3 or 4 countries decide they want to be elected, it creates an electoral dynamic that sometimes sees you on the outside looking in. But Security Council reform is something that we think is overdue, something that we hope happens in the near to medium term, and we continue to be part of a group of countries from around the planet that believe that a more transparent, open, democratic Security Council with perhaps 22, 23, some as even high as 25 members is probably the way to go, and perhaps with the possibility of creating a 3rd category of membership. So you would have permanent, the 5, you would have elected for 2-year terms as you have now, but you might have a 3rd category of membership where a country could be elected, let's say, for 4 or 5 years with the possibility of being re-elected, but it would be accountable. The issue here is one of accountability. The 5, they are there. But for the others, we think that accountability has to be the principle and transparency.
Thank you. Let's move to bilateral relationships between the United States and Canada. We have a large, long, mostly open border. Why aren't you coming to steal our jobs?
Because we have our own.
Damn you, Canada.
You know, I mean, I think, you know, in the late 1980s, we decided in Canada that we would take the risk of integrating ourselves more strongly from an economic perspective with the U.S. Before the 1980s, Canada was a highly protected and highly closed market. And with the advent of free trade between Canada and the United States, and then subsequently the NAFTA process with Mexico, Canadians really did place their bet on a greater level of economic integration in North America, recognizing that regional productivity and regional economic capacity was going to be an important factor, not only in the late 20th century or beyond. Canada's economy is similar to that of the United States, but it's very different. It's different because of the distances, clearly, and the implications and the costs that go into that. It's different from the point of view of the composition of its workforce, a very heavily dependent natural resource component in Canada in many parts of the country, much more so than the United States, a manufacturing sector that has required a high level of specialization in Canada, particularly in areas like telecom and the automotive sectors, and then in Eastern Canada, a fishery that for years was the major employer and then fell on hard times and has now resulted in the maritime provinces in Canada having to reinvent themselves. But we still believe that open markets, that the ability to trade, because we are a country that requires not only export, but we also require to be able to import, because we make far more than we consume in Canada. So we need to be able to ship our goods to the United States, ship our goods to China, to Europe, and as a result, Canada has been a free trader for a very, very long time, because it is the very lifeblood of what our society is if we're going to continue to grow and prosper. So from that standpoint, I think we remain committed to the concept of a more integrated North America, and we want to see both the United States and Mexico now work more fully to establish better competitiveness and productivity for North America, because in the world of the 21st century, it is about the region that you're from that is going to matter, in our judgment, more than the country that you're from.
Thank you. There are issues related to economic integration that at the present time, I wouldn't say separate the United States and Canada, but that we're working through. And one of those issues is the Keystone XL pipeline. Can we talk a little bit about where that project fits in with Canada's overall energy, natural resource strategy?
Well, Canada is a major producer of hydrocarbons. It's part of our economic landscape. In Western Canada, provinces such as Alberta and Saskatchewan, the petroleum and natural gas industries are absolutely critical to the economic well-being of those of the people who live in those areas. In the eastern part of Canada, increasingly natural gas, as I mentioned earlier, in Nova Scotia, and the offshore oil and gas development in Newfoundland. But in the energy sector, we have had a relationship with the United States that goes back, if not a century, pretty close to it. I mean, the lights in this room depend on the ability of Canada and the United States to, in essence, work in an integrated grid for electricity. It's the hydroelectric power generated in Quebec that brings electricity to the northeastern United States. We only remember that when the lights go out. And it's those damn Canadians, you see. But between Manitoba and Minnesota and all the way down to Chicago and Illinois, it's energy that's transported north-south that allows both economies to prosper. XL is part of that dynamic. Canada has oil. It's going to produce that oil because it must, from the point of view of its economic viability. It will do so with technology that over the long term is going to reduce its carbon footprint. It already has. I visited the oil sands in 1970, and when I went back 35 years later, the nature of the production was utterly different in terms of how it was being done and the kinds of issues that were associated with environmental protection and consciousness. We will have to move that oil. Where would we like to sell it first and foremost? In the United States of America, because we think that's beneficial to the US and obviously beneficial to Canada. But if the United States takes the decision that it does not want that oil, Canada will find a market for it. And that my Prime Minister has been absolutely categorical on, and there are customers out there. But we believe that North America should come first in terms of our economic orientation, and we will continue to take that as the starting point in our discussion, in the hope that not only we can work with the United States on this issue, but also over the longer haul work with Mexico so that we're able to have an integrated North American energy market. Because the reality is that in 50 years' time, if we don't have our own energy sources within our region, we may find ourselves in a cost scenario that simply exceeds our ability to function. And we believe that a North American approach would be a logical one for all three countries in North America.
Are there signs of a breakthrough on this issue, or are we still in a holding pattern?
We're still in a holding pattern, and we are now exploring in Canada potential alternatives, pipelines that might bring the oil from Alberta east to be able to be shipped from Atlantic ports, the possibility of pipelines across the Rockies to British Columbia, to be able to ship oil to the markets of China and to India. For us, it's a necessity to be able to find an outlet for that production. We can't use it all ourselves. Our economy simply isn't big enough, and it's the classic conundrum of Canada. We produce far more of everything than what we can consume, and it doesn't matter whether it's oil or wheat or uranium or hydroelectric power. We have to have the ability to move those products in an unfettered fashion, and Keystone is part of that dynamic.
Are there any other issues presently on the agenda between the U.S. and Canada?
There's a very important one that doesn't get a lot of play, but one that we think is pretty crucial, and that's the ability for us to build a new bridge in Detroit, between Detroit and Windsor. I was commenting to some of the Canadians who were here tonight that there's only one place in the U.S. where you can look south at Canada, and that's in Detroit, Michigan, because Windsor actually is to the south of the city of Detroit.
Have you really thought this through?
I have.
Okay.
And it's true. And my colleague, the Consul General in Detroit, constantly reminds us of this. But the bridge that connects Detroit and Windsor, more trade goes across that bridge on a daily basis than the bulk of the trade that Canada and the United States have with many, many other countries. I mean, close to $2 billion a day of trade moves north-south between Canada and the United States, and a significant portion of it moves across the current Ambassador Bridge between Detroit and Windsor. It is the lifeline of the automotive industry in North America. And parts and chassis and vehicles made in one country move across to go to the other, and increasingly Mexico is part of that dynamic as well, with many of the assemblers now having operations in Mexico. We have been for the last 20 years trying to create a second bridge. And it has been a hugely complex issue because the owner of the Ambassador Bridge is not either government, it is a private individual who has gone to court and has successfully blocked the ability of the two countries to decide on creating the kind of infrastructure that we need for our own economic well-being and development. So that's something to watch. We will always have issues. I'd like to joke that with many audiences that, you know, Canadians and Americans tend to fight about things we eat. We fight about potatoes. We fight about country of origin labeling on meat. You know, we fight about lobster. I mean, if you're a lobster fisherman in New Brunswick today, American lobster is pretty unpopular. And so we have an ongoing set of challenges as a function of the integrated nature of our economies and the local interests that we may have in a specific product area or in a specific area of specialization. But we tend to work those things out, as we've done, for example, on water management in the Great Lakes, as we have done on border management. I mean, you alluded to this border that's 5,000 kilometers in length. I mean, it's a marvel to see how that functions. I mean, it's fast. If it involves goods, it's reasonably quick. It's not the kind of situation that you see in crossing frontiers in many parts of the world. You know, we haven't had any violent eruptions between Canada and the United States in over 200 years.
That one was our fault, right?
Well, you know, as someone once characterized it to me, that war was a tie.
Okay.
Yeah, but you know, it works, and we have an undertaking with each other to try to make it work and make it work better to the benefit of both. And I think we have done a not unreasonable job over the course of the years.
We have an interesting dynamic in American politics where if we don't like a policy, whether it's healthcare, multilingualism, immigration. If we don't like a proposed policy, we compare it to Canada. And we say, what? Do you want to be like Canada with the socialized medicine? Do you want to be like Canada with the bilingual education? Do you want to be like Canada with the very open immigration policies? To which I answer, yes, we would like to be like Canada.
Well, I agree.
Can you can you tell us how these three? I know I'm asking a huge and broad question. Can you tell us a little bit about where these three largely domestic policies fit
Yeah.
in Canada's sort of self-conception?
Look, I would say the following to you, and this is why I always use the analogy of similar but different when I look at Canada and the United States. But the bottom line, the organizing principle of our two societies is very different. In this country, you are about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those are all issues that are associated with the individual. It is the primacy of the individual that is the very core of the American identity, and frankly, it's what makes America great. The ability of this country to constantly reinvent and to offer opportunity to any individual to come and excel. And that is something that I have admired all my life. I grew up for a period in this country, and it is what makes the United States different than anywhere else I've ever been in the world. Canada, while it's similar, is organized on a different principle. Our three founding pillars in Canada are peace, order, and good government. Those are all issues associated with the community. The community in Canada, from the perspective of Canadians, has to take primacy over the individual if we're going to succeed in a country as large, as inhospitable, climatologically as Canada is, and with the great distances that separate us and our ability to interact with each other. And as a function of that, we have come up with a policy framework that works for us and is not necessarily an exportable model, but that takes into account the notion of a nation state, but cedes enormous control, as I said at the outset, to the local level of government, the provincial level of government, and municipalities, which in Canada do not exist in law, but are dependencies of the province. So it is the province in Canada that is the fundamental pillar of government. And the province is about the community. Healthcare in Canada is funded federally, but delivered provincially. Okay? And that's critical. That's absolutely critical. And when you have issues such as multiculturalism and immigration policy, Canada, being as big as it is and with a population that is not able to reproduce itself sufficiently to keep our number up in terms of overall population, we have to invite people from around the world to come to our country and join in the Canadian experiment. And as a result, we take approximately 1% of our population in as new Canadians every year. So when you are inviting 1% of your population to join you every year, you have to be able to ensure that those people succeed, not in the second or third generation, in the first. And so multiculturalism as a policy in Canada was created to permit just that, to permit an identity of a Canadian because you've come to a new land and you accept its values and its principles, but that you also maintain an organic linkage to what you were, what you brought with you, the language, the culture, because that's going to be an advantage for us. And I think the singular experiment of this principle in Canada is that can differences be something that make you stronger as opposed to something that divides you as a society? So far in Canada, it's worked. But the reason we are comfortable with that perhaps comes from the triad, if you will, of the origins of Canada. We have three founding peoples in Canada: the Aboriginal peoples, who were there first. Then we had Europeans who came, French and English. We spent a couple hundred years trying to figure that out from the point of view of the two solitudes and coming together in a multilingual, multicultural Canada as immigration was taking shape. And all of this has resulted in a sort of foundation for the modern Canada, which kind of works. But it's different. It's different from the premise of how the United States is constructed. And what we do works for us. It is not necessarily a model that is ready-made to be exported elsewhere. And it's up to individual countries to decide, and in their own societies, what it is that they would like to have by way of health, by way of education, by way of social services. And in Canada, that communitarian aspect remains today the underpinning, if you will, of how we organize ourselves both governmentally and from the point of view of the relationship of the citizen with their government structures.
Would you say that there's a broad consensus between parties on the left, parties in the center, parties on the right behind this set of principles?
Absolutely. And whether you're right, center, or left in Canada, the nature of the healthcare system that we have is not a question. We are recognizing that we may have to do some fine-tuning as our population ages, but a publicly funded, publicly delivered healthcare system has been part of the Canadian landscape now for over 50 years, and most Canadians would say we want to keep it that way, but we may have to look at allowing private delivery of certain services to ensure that we can cut down, for example, on waiting times. The big complaint in Canada about public health is that if you're not really sick, you have to wait. If you need an MRI because your knee hurts, you're going to wait because someone who needs an MRI because they have cancer is going to get that service first. And that's part of the judgment that's made. But I think there is national consensus on these issues, and one that has served us reasonably well, I think, over the course of the last 50, 60 years.
We would call those death panels. I think that would be the technical term that would be used in
it isn't a question.
political discourse.
It is not a death panel. It is a question of what constitutes critical care. Someone who clearly is ill and requires immediate service goes to the front of the queue. Someone who is sore may have to wait a little bit, and that does not,
regardless of how much money they have.
If they have the resources and wish to go to Buffalo for their MRI, they're free to do so. And people do. But the reality of what we deliver at home is that if your medical professional demonstrates that the need is there for you to receive the best and most immediate attention possible, you get it.
We noticed 3, 4, 5 years ago, as the American banking system collapsed and dragged the entire U.S. economy with it, that Canada somehow managed not to get dragged along. How did you pull that one off?
Well, there's an old joke that's told in Canada, and I think it's true, that one of the differences between Americans and Canadians is that Americans like to make money and Canadians like to count it. And I think that's true. We are not as risk-taking as in societal terms as this country. One of the things I marvel at in the U.S. in terms of its financial structure is the whole concept of Chapter 11, where you can go into bankruptcy and be protected from your creditors, and you're bankrupt on Friday, and Monday morning, you're in business. In Canada, if you go bankrupt, you suffer. And you suffer for a while before you can get your standing back. And I think because Canadians perhaps are more averse to risk, we did not find ourselves victim of subprime. And when our banks went to the government in 2002, 2003, with a request that the government allow them to merge so that they could create super banks to be able to compete with Wall Street and with the street in London, our government said no. And said that no, we have a first responsibility to ensure sound financial services to Canadians, and if beyond that you have the ability to be a player internationally, you do so with our blessing. But as a result, we didn't find ourselves in the quagmire of over leverage and over risk. And as a result, at the end of the financial crisis, Canada's banks, which had grumbled, I can tell you, through most of the heyday of the early part of the decade at how they were being hamstrung and handcuffed by the government, they came out looking all right. But, in Canada, it's much tougher to own a home than it is in the United States. The concept of credit in Canada is much more rigorous in terms of how you qualify than in this country. And perhaps that keeps us from achieving greater individual wealth, but it keeps a financial system of a national nature intact. And I think the financial crisis proved to Canadians that discretion at times is the better part of valor.
What would you say the challenges lying ahead for Canada are? You mentioned an aging population. That's something that's affecting many European countries. You mentioned a need to move the oil and natural gas. What else do you see when you look into the future?
I think we have to make a decision in Canada in terms of what we want to look like by 2100. There's a lot of discussion now in Canada about, can there be a Canada with 100 million people? We're a country of 34 million right now. Can we grow at that kind of accelerated rate because people, A, want to come to Canada, and B, Canada has the ability to absorb them? These are very fundamental decisions as a society that we need to take. We know that people, when they come to Canada, aren't coming for the weather. So we have to find a way of accommodation, and our cities are going to increasingly grow in size to a much greater extent than we've seen, and we need to have the ability to invest in the appropriate infrastructure to ensure that quality of urban life in Canada continues to be a positive. I think one of the things that Canada has to decide in terms of its both domestic and international relationships in the future will be how we manage our water resources. Canada is home to 8% of all the fresh water in the world. That's going to be, I think, a commodity in the year 2075 that's going to be more valuable even than oil is today. And so how we manage that resource and what we do with it is something that is going to be important. Our education system requires constant refinement. And when you have a population that is aging, you don't have as many people entering university. So we are opening more and more to foreign students in Canada, which I think is a great way to create people who some of them want to stay in Canada and be contributors. All of this, I think the pace of change, not only in Canada but worldwide, is something that we're going to have to get our heads around and be able to have the governance structures to be able to deal with it, and the kind of public investments to be able to ensure that quality services, both in healthcare, transportation, continue to be at a level consistent with people's contribution as taxpayers. And that's another issue that distinguishes Canada and the United States. You will find Canadians generally smile when Americans complain about taxes. We pay a lot more in Canada, but we have something to show for it from the point of view of our healthcare and our education system. And to continue to finance those investments is something that is going to be, I think, a challenge for governments irrespective of political stripe.
Thank you. There are few, shall we say, preconceptions that many Americans have about Canada and Canadians. I myself have, I think, sometimes fallen prey to these stereotypes. Canadians are widely thought to be extremely polite and extremely nice as a result, and well dressed. And as a result, when I travel internationally, as many Americans do, I'll tell people I'm Canadian. I'm not afraid of that. I find that people are much more friendly and warm. They say, "What part of Canada?" I say, "The cold part." Which brings me, of course, to the second thing we think we know about Canada, which is that you have 11 months of winter. I myself have enjoyed the pleasures of strolling the streets of Toronto in February, where the wind literally passes through your body and out the other side, which sort of confounds the law of physics. We believe that your beer is terrible. This is why for most of our recent history we had no leg to stand on in this regard because our beer was every bit as terrible. But now we say, oh, Canadian beer. Blah, 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 blah. Tell me something about Canada. Tell me something about Canada that defies the stereotypes, that defies the view of a country huddled together for protection from polar bears, watching hockey.
Well, we watch a lot of hockey, that's for sure, and it is our national passion, and I think will always be our national passion. But look, I think the interesting thing about Canada is the part that people don't live in, and that's the North. I think the importance of the Arctic in your generation is going to be absolutely huge, and Canada and the U.S. and the other countries of the Arctic Council are going to have to get their act together in terms of how we manage the Arctic, because the Arctic is resource rich. The Arctic is also the most environmentally fragile place on the planet, along with Antarctica. And that's the part of Canada that very few people know. People think it's just ice and snow. If you're in the north in Canada in July, you'd be amazed at the amount of life and the flora and the fauna that you see in the north. And 24 hours of sunshine, you can tee off on a golf course at midnight and play 18 holes early in the morning. I mean, it's an astonishing part of the world. And I think that is the undiscovered Canada. That is the part of Canada I would encourage all of you to go and see, because it's endless. I mean, it's the distance between Toronto and Alert, which is high in the Arctic, is the same distance as between Toronto and Manaus in Brazil. And that's huge distance. And so that, I think, is one of the things that is little understood about Canada. The other thing that I think is not understood about Canada is just how diverse a country we have become. Toronto, which is Canada's largest city with close to 6 million people, 52% of the population of that city was born somewhere else. That's an astonishing figure. And unlike some countries where if you're born overseas, you can never aspire to be the leader of that country, Canada has had governors general and to date no prime ministers, but will soon, people who were born in another country, because that's a reflection of who and what we are through our immigrant reality in Canada. And remember that 34 million people, yes, but 70-80% of those people live within 250 miles of the U.S.-Canada border. So these are realities. The other thing is that if you're really looking to see the difference between Canadians and Americans, look at their shoes. Canadians wear shoes generally that have tread, because we know that if you get your feet wet, you'll get sick. And as a result, the things that you do in Canada to confront the elements, you wear a hat, you wear mitts, and not gloves. In Canada, you wear mitts because you got to keep your hands warm and you keep your feet warm. And if you do that, you can survive the winter. And surviving the winter is what defined the country at its founding. It was not easy to be living in the middle of the prairies in Canada when my grandparents were born at the turn of the 20th century, and people survived. And the inhospitable nature of man and climate, I think, still today defines the psychology of this country, and that spirit of community, of coming together to survive, which I think still is at the very, very core of the ethos of what it means to be a Canadian.
Thank you. Well, before we move to the Q&A portion of the evening, I do have one more question for you. When American political leaders write books, everyone panics, because the books are invariably self-serving tributes to themselves. American politicians write books about them. Your Prime Minister, Harper, has recently published a book on hockey, which he has apparently written while he was in office as a labor of love. And the book is called A Great Game, Forgotten Leafs and the Rise of Professional Hockey. I've got to believe that this is emblematic to some degree.
We've had politicians who have written very self-serving books about
Well, good for you.
themselves, but
There's
no,
hope yet.
The Prime Minister is a fan's fan, and you know, something that you learn as a child in Canada is about hockey. I mean, hockey is the passion that unites us from coast to coast to coast. When Canada plays the U.S. more and more, the level of rivalry does not know limits. In the past, Russia, the Soviet Union in the days of the Cold War, was the great rival. But the connection of teams in Canada with communities is really at the core of the Prime Minister's book, because there were a lot of Leafs in Toronto before the current vestige of the Toronto Maple Leafs became the singular professional franchise. Just like there were a lot of teams in Montreal, the Maroons, who people forget, who preceded the Canadiens. And in the city of Quebec, the Nordiques are not a dream, they will be a reality again, and everyone in Quebec City will tell you that that is exactly the case. But you have junior teams, you know, and a Canadian reality, the way Little League Baseball is for Americans, is for parents to get up at the crack of dawn and take their kids to the rink and share Tim Hortons coffee while they watch the little guys and little girls, because the Canadian women are a powerhouse in hockey, play the game. And it is part of that compelling narrative of what we are as a society. And hockey is beginning to reflect Canada. The top center iceman of the Toronto Maple Leafs today is a gentleman by the name of Nazim Kadri. Nazim Kadri's parents came from Pakistan, and he is now a star in the NHL. Rafi Torres, who plays for now, I think, the Phoenix Coyote, his parents came from Peru, and he plays hockey. And Darren Setaguchi of the Winnipeg Jets, his parents are originally from Japan. And so hockey is also reflecting that Canadian reality. But hockey is part of our history. Hockey is part of the Canadian identity. You know, we're in the 60th anniversary this year of the signing of the armistice to end the Korean War. And in the Korean War, the most iconic Canadian image, above and beyond the memory of those who perished in that war, is a painting in the National War Museum in Ottawa of Canadians playing ice hockey on the Han River in Korea in January of 1953. And that is part of our identity. The Prime Minister, I think, really captured a very, very central dimension of what it means to be Canadian. And, you know, having been old enough to remember 1972 and the Super Series with Russia, which was like fighting the Cold War on ice, I mean, the legend of hockey for Canadians simply grows. Vancouver was a great moment to win a gold medal on home ice. Our hope is that we will defend in Sochi and defend well. But it doesn't matter whether you're in Goose Bay, Newfoundland, Duncan, British Columbia, or Inuvik in the Northwest Territories. When it's cold out, you put the skates on, you skate, you play hockey, and you revel in something that does unite us as a country and as a people in a very, very unique and fundamental way. The closest thing I've seen in my career to this is the passion of Brazilians for soccer, for football. It's the same kind of psycho-emotional connection that sport brings to the dynamic of the society.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll now turn things over for Q&A.
Well, before we go into Q&A, I can say that I can match that up with Cricket for India.
We play cricket too.
Yeah, I know that. On behalf of the students, I would like to thank you for a very interesting discussion. I certainly learned a lot of new things about Canada, and I'm sure the other students have some questions for you. So do we have some questions for the ambassador? Right there.
If you'd wait for the microphone to come.
He's getting a mic for you.
Yeah.
One of the main things that I've gotten from your presentation is that Canada is so communal and brotherly and sisterly. and just that you seem to really, like everyone. Is there anyone that you don't like? I mean, in the United States, you step outside of this college, and I feel like so much of the world just despises us because we despise it back. I envy your country because of this. And just, is there anyone who's exempt from your love, for lack of a better word?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the issue, but I mean, we're not pushovers either. I mean, we have serious issues with Iran, for example. I mean, no diplomatic relations. I'd say that's pretty serious. Now, some of that goes back to the 80s when we did certain things that the Iranians didn't like, and we stand by what we did. But I mean, it isn't that we don't have issues. It's just that we deal with those issues in a way that's conducive, at least in my lifetime, to the ability to establish a long-term, workable kind of process with people. And you can do that when you're a country that is unthreatening. The United States is a large superpower, and in many parts of the world, the United States impacts on people not because it wants to, just because it does. So it isn't a question of being hated. It's a question of how people internalize what they see and feel about you. And from a Canadian perspective, we've always been an open society from the point of view of willingly welcoming people from around the world. And even in quarters of the world where we wouldn't construe people to be quote unquote friendly to the West, they probably have a relative in Canada of some sort, that gives them, some window, if you will, on an understanding of that society. I remember an American colleague telling me once, he said, you have no idea how hard it is to be a superpower. And he's right. I mean, it's an enormous responsibility. It's an enormous weight. This country has stood up over and over again for the values that it believes in, and that's to be admired. But in certain quarters, there are people who have a different point of view. That's life. That's the way reality is. But it's not something that should ever be an embarrassment to Americans, because the contribution of the United States is without reproach and without question in terms of making the world better. In Canada, we've carved out our own little niche that works for us, country of 34 million people. I always tell myself, sober myself every day, there's more people living within 200 miles of where we sit right now than in the entirety of my country. That's significant. When you're small, you can do things. Singapore is the perfect little island because it has 3 million people and can get itself organized. Canada can organize itself in a way because it has a small population. A larger country has larger challenges. People just do it differently. But that communitarian dimension is what has served us in terms of our ability as a society to deal with those issues. But it hasn't always been pretty. We went through some very, very rigorous and tough debates and sometimes violence during the 1970s with respect to our duality of two cultures. We've had major challenges with our Aboriginal populations from the point of view of their place in the Canada of today and tomorrow, and they're the fastest growing demographic group in Canada. So there's no perfection out there for anybody. You just got to work at your problems in the way that makes the most sense. But you have to work. You have to work and you have to come together. And when we don't come together, when it's just conflict all the time, that's when perspective is lost and the debate becomes pure ideology and you can't get things done. And that is, I think, the fear that people have perhaps of some of the phenomena that we're seeing right now. In Canada, we get in there politically and mix it with the best and with each other. But at the end of the day, you have to come together to solve the problems.
Thank you. Any more questions? In the back.
Good evening. Earlier you discussed humanitarian efforts that Canada has done for the international community, but I was wondering about human trafficking and Canadian law. I know human trafficking is a big issue in the international community today, and I wanted to know, is Canadian law helping them or hurting them?
Well, certainly on the illegal trafficking of migrants, Canadian law has been quite rigorous in terms of its treatment of those, for example, who have been brought by smugglers across the Pacific in ships from places like Sri Lanka and others. The trafficking of people from Europe through organized crime connections is something that the RCMP has gotten out there after for a very, very long time. As a country that accepts 300,000 migrants, including refugees, in that on an annual basis, we have to ensure that the structure of law that permits that kind of movement of people works. So we do fairly rigorous checking of who comes in, and we do fairly rigorous checking to make sure that those who have come to Canada are there legally. And so from that standpoint, the federal and provincial governments and law enforcement agencies work very, very closely to ensure that we don't create a conduit by being an open society for people to enter with nefarious purposes, or indeed to try to use Canada as a jumping off point to go somewhere else, i.e. the United States. So it is something that our Department of Public Safety, which integrates the RCMP, the Canadian Border Services Agency, all of the agencies that basically manage inflow in a very, very coordinated way to ensure that those who are in Canada are there under the appropriate mechanisms and procedures, and that we don't create a scenario where illegality becomes the main movement, if you will, in terms of the people who come. And we've had challenges. I mean, we had to change our entire system of refugee determination because of a reality where anyone who showed up at a Canadian airport could say, I'm a refugee, and because of the system, they were able to stay in the country for 2 years, and then they could abandon their claim and be deported. We can't have that. We have to have a system that's transparent, a system that people have confidence in, both those in the country and those who wish to come. And the legal framework that we've instituted over the course of the last decade or so, I think, is helping us do that better.
Thank you. More questions there?
Hello. So I'm very interested in the economic integration issues that you mentioned with the pipeline. From what I understand, this issue affects environment, political issues, and the economy. So I know that there's issues with leaks, greenhouse gases, and times are always changing. As you said, from my understanding, Canada is a growing powerhouse with all the resources that it has. So what do you think is going to happen in the future?
Well, look, I think all of the issues you've raised are out there from the point of view of what we have to take into consideration when you do major infrastructure of this nature. I mean, clearly, you have to ensure that the pipeline technology is the best available, and those who are at the forefront of pipeline technology say that what is going to be built is state-of-the-art in every way. Is it perfect? Will it never leak? Nobody can make that promise. You know, you just have to make sure it's maintained, and you have to make sure you install it in a way that's consistent with best practices. But the environmental issue is one issue. Another issue is, if we don't transport it that way, how are we going to do it? Well, we're probably going to do it by rail. And we've had incidents over the course of the last year in Canada and the United States where there have been derailments of rail cars full of oil that, in the case of a small town in Quebec, wiped out the downtown core and killed 56 people and injured I don't know how many others. So it is a technology that has risk, but can we manage that risk appropriately? And our judgment is that you can. You may disagree with me, but that's, we're entitled to disagree. The oil sands themselves, if you haven't seen it, I urge you to go, because seeing is believing. I mean, as I said to you, when I first went there in the 70s, it was a grim industrial landscape. Today, it is a very, very different situation. Technology is advancing, and is it perfect? No technology is. But has it advanced enough from the point of view of meeting standards and obligations set up both by the national authority and the provincial authority in Canada? We are ensuring that they do that. So this is a question that is both political, economic, and at the end of the day, for some, moral. And we have to accept that the debate will will be undertaken on those terms, and decisions will be made that we will have to live with the realities of. But can we do it? From a Canadian perspective, we believe yes.
Thank you. Just as a question, in the United Nations, in a consensus of the United Nations, what holds precedence when it comes to economic gains and environmental gains, and where does it sway on the scale?
I don't think you can say that it sways on this particular issue. This issue is not being treated in UN fora. What is being treated in UN fora is the phenomenon of climate change and greenhouse gas emissions, and the kinds of objectives that we're going to have over the course of the remaining period till 2020, that undertakings were made in Copenhagen, and then what we're going to have is a post-Copenhagen framework going forward. They're meeting in Warsaw as we speak here tonight, trying to hammer out some sort of process to see what we will have in terms of longer-term targets. I think if there's a lesson of the last 20 years with respect to climate change, is that you have to have achievable targets, not just targets for the sake of targets, and then you have to have a way to be able to ensure that the investments are made, to minimize the negatives and accentuate renewable energy and other lower carbon footprint types of undertakings that are going to create the basis for improving your overall environmental quality. And in certain quarters, that's highly polemical, because there are countries who are industrializing rapidly who say, well, I have a right to use the same technologies you did 20 years ago, and that will, of course, have a very negative effect in terms of where the environment is. But nothing is done in isolation, and this in essence has to be weighed. And I think there will be moments when the environmental argument will be the primary one out of necessity, and there will be others when the economic argument, because of the need to create an economy that can grow and accommodate a population that is expanding, is going to require the focus of policymakers. So I don't think it's a zero-sum game. I think, like many things, it ends up somewhere in the middle.
Thank you. Additional questions?
Yeah, I just had a quick question on immigration policy in Canada. I know we've already talked about the statistic that you guys take in 1% of your population every year, which I guess in comparison that's a large amount, and I guess you could describe it as being an open policy. But I guess my question is more, I'd like you to touch on what kinds of individuals is Canada accepting. I mean, you already talked about the refugees. Well, other than that, there must certainly be some other form of criteria. So I'm thinking more along the lines of, college education, or somebody who wants to invest a great deal of money into Canada.
Would you like to invest a great deal of money into Canada?
No, not me.
I wish I could. You can speak with him after that.
No, look, I mean, the way Canada manages immigration is that it's skills-based migration. I'll tell you a story. I have a friend from Costa Rica who went to Penn State University and graduated in mechanical engineering, and when he finished at Penn State, he wanted to emigrate to Canada. And he applied as a mechanical engineer. And he applied once, and he was denied. We have too many mechanical engineers in Canada already. We don't need more. He applied again, didn't get in. His hobby was tuning pianos. When he applied as a piano tuner to go to Canada, he was accepted like that because we needed piano tuners. And the way Canada organizes its immigration is that it looks at what the labor markets in Canada require, and then recruits people with the skills to be able to meet those requirements. And it is a shared jurisdiction with the provinces. So a province like Quebec or a province like Manitoba or Saskatchewan is able to identify those it needs from the point of view of the labor market in its country. And you accumulate, when you apply as an immigrant to Canada, you accumulate points in your application for your education, for your language, for your skills. And all of this ultimately is part of the decision making as to whether you will be a successful candidate or not. And some people argue, but that flies in the face of the reality that immigration should be a right. And yes, we don't dispute that any individual who wishes to go from point A to point B should have that ability. but the people in point B have something to say about what it is that they require from the point of view of ensuring that those who come succeed. Because the secret of managing immigration well is to ensure that those who migrate to your country succeed in the first generation. All too often the mythology of immigration is we come and that first generation works for success in the second. That was the way migration worked in the middle 20th century and earlier. Migration in the 21st century requires portability of qualifications. If you have PhDs in electrical engineering driving taxis, that is not successful immigration. And so this is what the challenge is for so many countries, the US, Canada, Australia, Europe, and we have found a way to make it work for us. And yes, there investors certainly can be considered. Refugees, Canada takes proportionally a very high number of refugees because we believe in humanitarian principles. And so people now who are being displaced in many parts of the world will at least have a shot. But we don't just simply pick them up and put them on a plane and send them to Canada. I mean, we do the kind of due diligence necessary to ensure that we're bringing people to Canada and inviting people to Canada who will be contributors. And so far the system continues to work reasonably well, notwithstanding challenges going forward.
Thank you. In the back?
Your Excellency, you mentioned a friend from Costa Rica, and I know that with friends from Costa Rica, Nauru, and Cape Verde, and of course Romania, you have a CD outside singing 12 songs of peace.
This can be found at the merch table.
Yes.
Right by the door.
And I wonder if you could just comment a little bit about that, and certainly how it took you out of your normal work in diplomacy, or maybe it's another form of
No,
that.
it is a
Thank
form
you.
of diplomacy. And, 5 of us at the UN came together in a special project to sing for peace. And it was a marvelous experience because it took us out of our comfort zone a little bit, I'd say some, like certainly me, and provided us with an opportunity. And we all came from various parts of the world, from Europe, from the Pacific, from Africa, from Latin America, from North America. And we worked with a very committed foundation of youth ambassadors here in New York that support people coming together and better understanding of the differences amongst us as a point of unity as opposed to a point of divergence. And it was a lot of fun. I discovered that cutting a record is pretty hard work. It doesn't come easily. You have to practice, for example, and rehearse, and it wasn't easy. And we had a magical musical director who, when he mixed it all together, we said to each other, "Is that us?" And it was, and that was great. But it just shows the power of positive thinking from the point of view of people willing to go outside their comfort zone and beyond themselves. And honestly, if there's something the world needs right now, I think everywhere it's that. I mean, we maybe because of technological advances or the nature of progress in the 21st century, it's pretty easy to kind of find a little space for yourself and be happy there and not take any risk and not necessarily stretch yourself and your limits a little bit. I think we need to stretch ourselves and our limits as a human race a whole lot more perhaps than we're doing as a means of hopefully solving some of the world's problems.
Are you planning a solo career?
I am not planning a solo career. There is some discussion of a Christmas album, but but I don't know. And we will perform again, which I didn't think possible, but we will in the next few weeks. We're going to be performing with the Salvation Army in Manhattan, and it's all for a good cause and a lot of fun. But we have day jobs, and so we have to ensure that we do our work at the UN first, and that eats up a lot of time, believe me.
Thank you. We have a time for a couple of more questions. Here.
Now, will you be investing a lot of money in Canada? Because
Perhaps.
okay.
Good evening, Your Excellency. The Canadian government and much of the Commonwealth operate on a parliamentary system, and we here in the United States operate on a presidential system. To what extent are these forms of government similar, and how are they different? And as you're well aware that we here in the United States are experiencing a time of hyperpartisanship, and our government actually shut down over deep ideological divides. Is it possible for a small extremist faction of the government to effectively take a country hostage if they don't get what they want in a parliamentary system?
It's harder. It's harder, but you know, I mean, the two systems are not dissimilar from the point of view of Westminster-type origins. I mean, you are elected a member of Parliament in Canada from a district. It's a first-past-the-post system, so if there's 6 candidates, the candidate with the most votes is elected. The party with the most seats in Parliament forms a government, or has the opportunity to form a government if they have a majority, and if they have a minority, they can try to govern as a majority or form a coalition. So one of the differences between the two systems, at least from a Canadian perspective, is that we have a second chamber, we have a Senate in Canada, but it's not elected, it's appointed. There's a lot of questions as to that right now in Canada, because there have been some issues associated with expenses of senators that have been somewhat problematic. But I think, you know, your system of governance, I mean, really does depend, you know, on the nature of your society and its founding principles. And, you know, the U.S. Constitution as a document is a marvel of human engineering. And the system of checks and balances is astonishing from the point of view of people in the 18th century being able to come up with it. But it needs constant upkeep, and one might suggest some massaging. And that's something that the U.S. will work its way around. And you know, I think partisanship is part of reality anywhere in the world. I mean, you know, the ultimate manifestation of hyper-partisanship is conflict. You know, and you see that in many corners of the world. You know, yes, it's hyper-partisan, but you know, it's not a shooting war. You know, and I guess that's good as a minimum.
We had one of those too.
Yeah, but you did a long time ago, and it solved a particular issue that was predominant at the time. And now, 150 years later, that issue has been put to rest, as it well should be. But, you know, I mean, in a parliamentary system, if you have a majority, then there has to be a level of responsibility of how the majority exercises its power. If you're in a coalition, by definition, there are checks and balances on what you can do. Canada has not had a history of coalition governments. In fact, the C word in Canada is demonization by those in the political realm. But you know, which system of government works best? I don't think you can really make that judgment. I think each system works as it should for the society that has adopted it. But and some societies have shifted. You know, and I mean, you know, I think something that the U.S., and this is from an outside perspective, I think needs to look at is how it can do some fine tuning, perhaps, to its organizing principle from the point of view of governance, to make it more effective and perhaps less hostage to narrow interest.
I mean, don't you think that you know, constitutional design can only take you so far? You know, in the sense that you can build an elaborate, complicated, sophisticated machine, but if the people operating that machine are idiots, what you will have is devastation.
Well, I think it speaks to the need for civic education as something that needs to be inculcated in a society from the get-go. You know, I mean, you know, participation rates in elections, it starts there. I mean, when 50% of the electorate is voting, you in essence get what you asked for. You know, if 90% of the electorate was voting, the result might be very, very different. Historically in Canada, we've had very high rates of participation in elections, 75, 80%. I mean, and in some referenda questions, I mean, as high as 98%. So that's citizen engagement. But, you know, I mean, if people aren't voting, then those who do vote are going to be the ones that express the view that is reflected in the governance of the country. And, you know, I mean, the League of Women Voters does a terrific job to try to get out the vote, and yet the percentage of people voting falls in every election. And Canada has the same issues as the U.S., very low turnout in municipal elections. I mean, part of civic education is being a participant and informing yourself so that you're able to make considered judgments and be a contributor to the forward movement of your society. And it starts, yes, with each of us deciding that that's important enough to invest time in. And I think that's something that is valid irrespective of what the system of government might be.
Thank you. One more question. The back.
Hello. Okay. Hello.
Hi.
So, something that was mentioned in the past was healthcare. The United States right now is undergoing a big healthcare reform that we've been working on. And it was even mentioned about Canadian healthcare. Would you call this healthcare similar?
No, it's very different. What you are having now is a system, if I
Don't sugarcoat it.
No, if I understand it correctly, a system for those who are uninsured to choose a plan, okay? And ostensibly those that were insured to keep the plan they had. That's the issue, I guess, that's being joined. In Canada, we don't have private health. All health in Canada is delivered by the state. Okay, so when you go to a doctor in Canada, the doctor doesn't bill you, he bills the state. Okay, when you have an operation, okay, the hospital does not send you a bill for the anesthesiologist and for the surgeon. They bill the state. Okay, and the state is who creates the standard of healthcare for the country, funds the system in Canada, and then each of the provinces delivers it locally for their population. Okay? Because of the fact that we are aging and there is greater demand for health services in Canada than ever before, in certain provinces we are now experimenting, for example, with the private delivery of health. Okay, where a private operator, let's say, will open an MRI clinic because we need more MRI clinics, but that private provider will not bill you. They will still bill the state. Okay? And so this is the differentiated, and it's universal in Canada. I mean, from the moment you arrive on the scene at birth, you are given a social insurance number and a health card number. And that is how you access the service. And it's a system that works well in an environment of 34 million people. Could it work well in this country? Personally, I don't think so, because it's just too big.
Well, there'd be no way for the insurance companies to make money.
Well, indeed, but I mean, but the issue here, and it is again part of those differences that I talked about earlier, is health a business or is health a public good? When you answer that question one way or another, you end up with differentiated systems. The British kind of came down in the middle. They have a national health service that provides a fairly reasonable public service, but they also have private health side by side because they felt it was necessary to allow people that option. But, it really does, healthcare can't be a business in the judgment of Canada. Healthcare has to be something that is a responsibility to take care of the citizens of the country, and that's our approach.
Thank you so much for spending this hour with us. I would urge all of you on the back of the program to scan the scan thingy and fill out the program evaluation, which is uploaded directly into the National Security Agency computer system. Without further ado, please join me in thanking Ambassador.
Thank you.